Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Well, thank you all for joining the webinar today. My name is Laura Dempsey, and I work for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. The topic today is wind energy and terrestrial mammals. So we'll be examining how several different species of terrestrial mammal interact with wind energy facilities. The webinar today is hosted by WREN, which stands for Working Together to Resolve the Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. And WREN is designated as Task 34 of the International Energy Agency, or IEA, Wind Technology Collaboration Program. And I'll start us off with just a really brief introduction to WREN. So WREN was initiated in the fall of 2012. It's currently in its third phase, which actually ends in September of this year. The purpose of WREN is to support deployment of wind energy through a better understanding of environmental issues, particularly those relating to monitoring and mitigation. And below, you'll see the link to the WREN website, and I can post that in the chat later on. So in its third phase, WREN has several main objectives. First, to identify global research priorities. This was published in the Journal of Global Sustainability. We also strive to aggregate and disseminate scientific information on global state of the science through a variety of mediums, including webinars such as this, research briefs, workshops, and publications. All these products can be also found on the TETHIS website. In September of 2002, I believe, we launched a monitoring and mitigations technology tool, which is also hosted on TETHIS. This tool allows users to browse different technological solutions for how to both monitor and mitigate impacts of both land-based and offshore wind to wildlife. And I believe the tool has around 81 entries at the moment, so I encourage you all to check it out. And without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce today's speakers. So first up, Carolina Esteves is a Brazilian biologist with a master's degree in biological sciences from São Paulo State University. She's been actively involved in the Institute for the Conservation of Neotropical Carnivores since 2012, contributing to the Friends of Jaguar and Puma Big Predators and Socio-Biodiversity in the Caatinga program. Passionate about wildlife conservation and an avid traveler, Carolina has lived in Australia, Canada, and Portugal. She's experienced in the field of ecology and conservation biology of medium and large mammals with an emphasis on carnivores. And she is actively engaged in mitigating human-wildlife conflicts, particularly those that involve large predators. Additionally, she is a research fellow at the National Center for Monitoring and Early Warning of Natural Hazards, contributing to their education program for the network of schools and communities in disaster risk prevention. Gonçalo Costa is a wildlife biologist who has been working in wolf conservation for more than 20 years. Besides conservation projects, he has participated in more than 40 wolf-related environmental impact assessments, most of them in regards to wind farms. He has held positions in the public sector and NGOs, and he currently works at BE, Bioinsight, and Ecoa, an environmental consulting company. He is also finishing his PhD on improving analytical methodologies to study large carnivores under EIA. Milligan received her PhD from Montana State University, where she evaluated the effects of rangeland management on sharp-tailed grouse ecology. She conducted the research she'll be presenting today as a postdoctoral researcher with the U.S. Geological Survey's Northern Rocky Mountains Science Center. Currently, she is working as a research biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Ecological Research Center, which is based in Reno, Nevada. There, she specializes on spatial and population ecology of wildlife in Western North America. So each of these speakers will present to you in turn, each for about 15 minutes, and then we'll use any remaining time for a Q&A. So I invite you to type any questions in the chat, and I can relay them to the participants during that Q&A session. Great, so I think Carolina, you are good to go. Let me get out of here.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I'm going to share my screen for just a second. Okay. Okay, so can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So good morning and good afternoon in Brazil and South America. My name is Carolina. I was already presented. So first, I want to thank you, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, for inviting me to talk a little bit about jaguars and pumas in Caatinga, and also the potential impacts of wind farms on their population. So the establishment of wind farms in Brazil is relatively recent. Since 2009, the growth has been significant. And the majority of wind energy production is in this region here, the northeastern region, is about 80%. And also the plan is to triple this installed capacity, mainly concentrated in the northeast and where Caatinga is situated. And so what is Caatinga that I just mentioned? Caatinga is a distinct ecosystem in Brazil with a semi-arid climate. It is considered one of the most biodiverse, seasonally dry tropical forests in the world. And due to its semi-arid condition, the Caatinga has two distinct seasons. One is the rain season that lasts about 8 months with no rain at all. And the other one is a rain season, lasts an average of 4 months. So as you can see here in this picture on the left is during the rainy season. And on the right, you can see during the dry season. So we have here people, wildlife, vegetation, all adapted to this climate condition. We have a term in Portuguese, which is onças, to refer to jaguars and pumas. So in Brazil, when we say onças, we know that we're talking about both species. And our program started in 2012. And after the arrival of the wind energy projects in the region that we studied, especially in 2015, 16, we started to include this new variable in our studies, both in human dimensions and also in the ecology and biology of the onças. Our research is in the area called Boqueirão da Onça. It's located here, just in the center of the Caatinga. It includes two protected areas, two types of protected areas. One is the national park, is this lighter green here, and the other one is an environmental protected area. So this last one, the legislation permits the installation of developments like wind farms and also people living there. Speaking a little bit about big cats, jaguars and pumas in Caatinga, both species are threatened in the biome. Jaguars are critically endangered and pumas are endangered. And our program has already monitored 4 onças with radial colors, including 2 pumas. One of them is Vitória, a female puma. Gonzaga is a male puma. And we monitored 2 jaguars, Rei, which is a male, and Luisa is a female of jaguar. Okay, now the potential impacts of wind farms in Brazil, just so you can understand. For the implementation of any type of project, it is required to go through 3 types of license. First, the preliminary, then the installation, and after that, the operation. Each of these phases has potential impact on jaguars and pumas population. So here we can see the degree of disturbance, and the installation phase, the installation stage of wind farms has critical disturbance for their population. We are going to see why and how. Okay, so in Caatinga, the greater wind potential is in the mountains. It is where the winds blow with more speed, but is also at the mountain tops where there are most preserved areas for jaguars and pumas. And usually they have their home range over the top of the hills. So it's where they seek for resources such as water, food, shelter. And so we can think that the immediate impact is habitat loss and also the disruption of connectivity between those habitats. Also, the removal of vegetation cover has a major impact. So it increases air and soil temperatures and also reduces resources, like I just mentioned, shelter, food, and especially for water reservoir. We're talking about an ecosystem which is semi-arid. So natural rainwater reservoirs are very, very special for them, very important. It's where the onça seeks to drink water. And also during the installation phase is when road construction takes place. It involves vehicle and worker traffic movements. This can increase noise, also roadkill, and especially the accessibility to previously remote areas, which can lead to hunting pressure. So we can say that these synergistic effects, the human presence plus the wind farms, has the tendency to change the behavior of the onças. So the tendency of the animals, the individual, is to move away from the area. It is the natural instinct of the animal. So this can cause the approaching to farms and communities, which in turn can increase depredation on herds, especially goats and sheep. And then in turn can lead to retaliatory hunting. This is a situation that the program has been trying to mitigate for some time, and the wind farms have increased these effects of human-wildlife conflicts when the herd's owner are going to persecute and kill the onças, so jaguars and pumas. A recent study in the region supports this assumption that I just mentioned, suggesting that pumas are more likely to approach communities due to disturbance on their natural habitat on the mountaintop, plus the availability of livestock, of domestic prey near the communities. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Victoria, one of our monitored puma. She's a pioneer because she was the first to be radio collared in the Caatinga, and she provided 10 months of relevant information on her movement. So if you see here in this map, each cross represents a wind term, when you have a total of 90 wind turbines, and I'll show you Victoria's movement during this 10 months of study. So it's possible to observe a pattern over her movement. I don't know if you noticed, but she hardly crosses the line formed by the wind turbines in these 10 months. And this has a very important consequence for the individual. It may force individuals to travel longer distance, impacting their ability to conserve energy. And remember that we are talking of a semi-arid region. So this is critical for thermoregulation of the animal. And now some challenges that we face in Caatinga. The construction of wind farms is much faster than studies on their impacts on onças populations. So we don't have time to assess, collect and assess all the data that we need to really assess the impacts of wind farms. And the impacts on terrestrial mammals are generally indirect, differently of the bats and birds, for example, and require medium and long-term studies. Also, the vulnerability and lack of information hinder effective local community participation in transitioning to a fair energy matrix. And this gap, the communication gap, can impact wildlife conservation efforts in the region, like the program that we have. Okay, so about legislation in Brazil, we don't have federal regulation for onshore wind farms, only for offshore. And the environmental regulatory agency often does not require a complete social environment impact assessment. And also we have loopholes in the law. For example, large wind farms can be split into smaller units and be licensed with simpler studies. This is very, very frequent here. And so we can say that we face a scenario of green on green controversies. On one hand, we have the growing demand for renewable energy, and on the other hand, the consequent impacts on the areas where the wind farms are installed. And so what's next? What's next? How to deal with this dilemma? I think that first, it's necessary to accept that there is a B side to renewable energy. They're not neutral. There are some impacts. And then we can consider some potential alternatives, which involves government regulations as well as actions that the companies can improve. For example, stronger protocols, stronger policies with guidelines addressing the impacts on sensitive terrestrial species, including onças and their natural prey, for example. Integrating landscape and energy infrastructures that can minimize the barriers to the movement of onças and facilitate their movements. And also, we can think about installing and maintaining artificial water sources, the natural reservoirs, for mitigating impacts during dry periods, especially. We can think also about exclusion zones around critical onças areas. Number 4, we need to actively engage the local communities. So environmental education and fair communication with the local communities who share the territory with the onças. So this is very important. Investment in long-term research. Fund long-term research on onças movements during all the stages, the preliminary, the installation and operational phases near the wind farms. And the last one that I think is to compensate the impacted areas with effective ecological restoration projects. The wind farms now, currently, they have these programs of ecological restoration, but they need to be effective, creating favorable environments for onças and their natural prey. This is really important. So I conclude my talk. Sorry, I have only 15 minutes to talk all this information. And I will conclude my talk with this question for reflection, which is, will you have enough time to make wind power generation truly clean and fair for wildlife, vegetation, and local communities in Caatinga? So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm going to answer later.
All right, thanks so much, Carolina. Gonçalo, you can go ahead, share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. Okay. Everything, the screen?
Looks good.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So let's try to pull this off in 15 minutes. Thank you for the invitation for this webinar. Okay, my name is Gonçalo Costa. I work for Bioinsight and Ecoa. And this presentation is an overview of the last 20 years of wind farm development and wolf conservation in Portugal, with pieces of some works that we have been done and presented on other CWWs and my ongoing PhD. So, okay, let's go to Iberian Peninsula. So this This is more or less the the current distribution of wolves in the Iberian, with a population of 2,500 animals, and about 300 of those live in Portugal. And because of that more or less small number, and because of it's the biggest predator in Portugal, is now fully protected, well, since 1988. So we cannot kill them, disturbing denning sites, destruct habitat. There's a specific law for the wolf in Portugal. And beside of that, the construction of new infrastructures in Portugal in wolf areas have to have an environmental impact assessment on several stuff and on the species also. For the last 20 years, a lot of infrastructures have been developed in Portugal, and especially on the wolf range, with a lot of highways, a lot of wind farms, and some electric hydropower electric dams. So most of these infrastructures in the Portuguese wolf range had to have an environmental impact assessment on the species. And to do that, we have to develop some monitoring programs to follow up the construction of these infrastructures. Especially the wind farm capacity have had an enormous growth in Portugal since 2000. And the first wolf monitoring programs are from 20 years ago. And after that, we have been a long way from there. One of the consequence of that is that we have managed to monitoring the wolf, at least more than 25 of the wolf range in Portugal, because of this wind farm or other infrastructures programs. So we have a lot of updated information on the wolf, at least in presence areas, because of this kind of project. So nowadays we have more than 1,000 wind turbines inside the wolf range in Portugal. More than 25 wolf packs affected by it, which is more or less more than 1/3. We have around 60-65 packs in Portugal, and we have some packs with more than 120 wind turbines inside their territory. So it's a lot. So what are the potential effects? Not impacts, but effects on the species. And let me say that wind farms don't kill wolves, as they will not kill jaguars and pronghorn antelopes, but people do. And most of the impacts related with wind farms are related with the indirect effects on the species. And in Portugal, we have managed to have some guidelines for wolf monitoring. And the two main effects to study that are on the guidelines is the displacement effect, or the avoidance that the construction of wind farms is doing, and the changes in the reproductive patterns of the species on the denning site areas. Those are the two main impacts that we should study when trying to assess the impacts of wind farms on the wolves. So our basic monitoring programs have a baseline study before the construction of the wind farm, where we study some ecological parameters from the species and try to have an overview of the species in the area. to try to develop some mitigation measures that may be changes in the layout of the wind farm to avoid certain areas, to develop some offset measures as for habitat management for increasing the prey species of the wolf, and then we have a final decision if we build the wind farm or not, and with which mitigation and offset measures. And then we try to follow this over the construction and operation phase, studying the same ecological parameters, and see if we can have answers about the impact on the species. From a review that we have made, the projects in Portugal mainly use the distribution of the species, presence, absence, the use of space, and the number of packs as the main parameters to study to assess the effects on the species, and also the location of the activity centers like denning sites, and not so much the number of wolves, the population numbers that are there, and this might be a thing to change in the future. We also try to manage to study the wolf prey distribution and some other parameters, densities, as a surrogate for wolf presence in wolf very low density areas when data is very scarce. Normally we use a BASI approach or a BAGI approach, where we divide the study area in a grid cell or in bandwidth areas, and we compare the impact area with the surrounding areas to see if there are changes in the parameters that are studied between the impact area and the surroundings. And normally you use scat surveys as the main methodology for wolf assessment, wolf presence assessments. Also camera trapping and howling stations for to discover where the wolves are reproducing. We don't use telemetry for environmental impact assessments here in Portugal, and then you can discuss this on Q&A afterwards. Just a quick note on that. So some objective results that we have managed to reach. So the human traffic, the disturbance, it's a fact. So if we compare pre-construction areas that were very inaccessible, like mountain ridges, like Carolina show in Brazil, in Portugal it's the same. You can have 10 times much more traffic after 3 years that we have in the beginning of the study. And in construction phases, you can have 36 traffic higher than we have. So this is a disturbance effect that it's clear. Another thing that is clear is that wind farms that are built near denning places, that like closer than 2-3 kilometers to the denning places, there are shifts, major shifts on the denning site location. So they can go further than 5 kilometers away from where they were. So in very humanized landscapes like Portugal, where there are not very much good places to breed for wolves, this is a very important impact that can lead to them try to den on worse places near human populations and cause an impact on the population, on the wolf population. Another thing, it's the breeding success of the packs normally decreases, or at least in our studies have decreased with time. So we have more packs reproducing at the beginning than on operation phase. But if you look at operation phase, at least at the first 3 years, we see an increase. So the wolves, they move away, they try to rebuild their ecology, but after 2-3 years, they start to establish themselves again further away from they were at the beginning, but they succeed to breed. So the not so objective thing that we can study, it's the displacement effect and what that means. So in a quick way, we normally use this Bassi approach. We transect all over the study area. We look for signs of wolves, normally scats. We record them, and we do this over time to see what we can manage with it. So at the end, we have some basic raw comparisons, or we use total number of scats per grid cell or the kilometric abundance index per grid cell. And we have some coarse heat maps where areas where is more used by wolves and less used. And we can compare these over time. This has a major, it's not a flaw, but something we can improve. It's using these raw numbers, we are forgetting about the imperfect detection process. We found some scats, but we miss some others. And if you have use all this information, we might have some different conclusions at the end. So we are introducing some bias. And you do that on the second survey, you add some more bias. And then another K times over the years. So we're adding bias of our imperfect detection process. And this is the process depends on the species characteristics, on spatial and temporal variation, or on the survey characteristics. So the effort that we do on each cell, the observer skills, etc. So we have to try to use, what we are trying now to use to improve this process is to change from these observational proxies, the number of scats per cell or something like that, to some more meaningful ecological parameters. And to do so, we are try to use now model frameworks like spatial capture, recapture, that will use this imperfect detection. They accommodate this on the models, so that we can have an unbiased information at the end. To do so, we have to improve the use of genetics on our scat surveys to get individual information from animals and in space. And with this set, we now have to do some wolf guidelines review to accommodate these changes. So as a take-home message, as I said before, wind farms don't kill wolves, and we have seen this in Portugal, but they will interfere on the individual level, at animal individual level, and that may affect the population level of the species if the number of animals decrease, if they don't breed, etc. These wolf monitoring programs are very costly in times and human and in resources, and many times get little data. So we have to improve our data analysis so that you can have robust assessments, and you can at the end have some sound decisions on the development of these wind farms or other infrastructures, so that mitigation measures or compensation measures are are built, are put in place in a correct way. So I thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks so much, Gonçalo. Now, last but not least, Megan, want to go ahead and share your screen?
Sure, thank you. All right, so I'm going to shift away from large carnivores and talk about effects of wind energy on ungulates, specifically pronghorn. So this was some research done in collaboration between the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Wyoming, looking at the impacts of wind energy development on pronghorn migration. And so, as I think most of us know, wind energy is one of the fastest growing sources of electricity worldwide, but most of the studies looking at the impacts of wind energy on wildlife have focused on avian and bat species. And we know significantly less about the impacts on terrestrial mammals. And we focused here on migratory species, which can be really important drivers of ecosystem processes, doing things such as maintaining biodiversity. But migrations, particularly those of large ungulates, which can range fairly widely, have been significantly disrupted by anthropogenic activities. As we build more roads, fences, pipelines, other forms of energy development, these all can intersect migration routes and disrupt or impede the movement of these animals. And imposing all of these barriers can either eliminate migratory populations entirely, or it can increase the rates of residency. So just stop certain individuals from migrating, which can also have population level consequences. And so with this study, we chose to focus on pronghorn. So these are a culturally and economically important animal in the Western United States. They're endemic to the grassland and sagebrush ecosystems of Western North America. And they're also somewhat unique in that they're semi-nomadic. So unlike some migratory animals that follow the same routes year to year and migrate every year, these animals are conditionally migratory. So some individuals will migrate every year, some will choose to migrate in certain years, and some just don't migrate. So there's a lot more variation in their behavior than in some other migratory ungulates. And there's been quite a bit of research on the effects of other forms of energy development, specifically oil and gas, on ungulates and their habitat selection behavior. And most ungulates exhibit consistent and sustained avoidance of oil and gas development, whereas pronghorn responses are more mixed, at least partially due to that, the fact that they have more variation in behavior than animals like mule deer, which tend to be more consistent. So we know a lot about the impacts of oil and gas development, but we know very little about the impacts of wind energy development on these ungulates. And these two forms of energy development can differ in a few important ways. So they both create new features on the landscape, whether it's turbines or well pads. And both of those can be related to habitat loss. Not only the habitat loss just in where the turbine or the well pad is built, but also through the related infrastructure like pipelines or roads, roads being one of the biggest forms of habitat loss associated with both forms of these types of energy development. But they also can have varying amounts of human activity. So as we heard, wind energy has a huge increase in human activity during the construction phase, but then that tends to drop off, at least compared to oil and gas development after the turbine or after they're running. And so once these two forms of development have been built, oil and gas development tends to have higher levels of human activity than wind energy. And the few studies that have looked at impacts of wind energy on pronghorn have looked at their seasonal habitat selection and have found some evidence for displacement over time, where these animals are tending to select their home ranges further away from turbines, as well as some evidence for fine scale avoidance. So animals that have their home ranges right around the turbines tend to use areas that are farther away from the turbines. But again, there was quite a bit of variation in individual variation among these animals that made it hard to piece apart clear negative effects of wind energy development. But these studies only looked at seasonal, so summer or winter habitat selection. So we were interested in looking or evaluating another important life stage, so migration. And to do this, we ask a series of questions. So first, just do the pronghorn still migrate through these wind energy facilities, or do these areas pose a barrier, completely stopping their migration? And then if they do continue to migrate through the wind energy facilities, is it affecting their behavior? So do pronghorn tend to speed up near the wind turbines, for example, which could have implications for their energy expenditures? Also, does it affect the fidelity to their routes or stopover sites? So stopover sites being these areas where animals will stop along their migration, and usually to access important forage resources, so to bulk up so that they continue their migration to reach their calving sites or winter areas. And so if these wind energy facilities are affecting their fidelity, that could have implications where we might be losing specific routes in a population, which could have implications long-term for the viability of whether these animals will remain migratory. And then finally, do these wind turbines affect their fine-scale habitat selection? So if the animals are still moving through the wind energy facilities, maybe they have to move around the turbines at a small scale as they're moving along the migration route. And so we conducted this study in South Central Wyoming. So this is in Western North America, Western United States. And here the black and white dashed area are all what the Wyoming Game and Fish Department considered critical pronghorn winter range. So really important habitat for pronghorn. And then all of these colored boxes are wind energy facilities. So the green boxes are facilities that were constructed during or prior to 2010. And then the larger blue areas are energy facilities that have been constructed in the last 5 years. So you can see a number of these are being constructed in critical winter range for pronghorn. And there's a large number of other applications to build more in this area. So it was a good area to look at the impacts of wind energy development on pronghorn. And so we monitored pronghorn using GPS collars in 2 time periods. So we had data from 2010 to 2012, and this overlapped with the construction of one of the wind energy facilities, and an additional few were already on the landscape. And then we had data from pronghorn collared from 2018 to 2020. And this time period was prior to and during construction of 2 of those 2 larger wind energy facilities, Ecoa and TD Flats. And so we used Brownian and Bridge models to characterize the migration, just to define the paths that these animals were using, and as well as their stopover sites along those paths. They also looked at the speed at which pronghorn were moving and the amount of time it took them to complete their migration. And then to look at fidelity, we looked at overlap between consecutive years. So this would be animals that we had 2 years of data, both prior to and during construction, to see if they used the same route or if they went somewhere else. And then we used resource selection functions to look at overall route selection. So how are they choosing their routes or their stopover sites? Is it in relation to turbines or to other habitat features? And then we use integrated step selection analysis to look at that fine scale movement behavior. Are they detouring around these turbines, or are they really just queuing off of other habitat features, for example? So we tracked a total of 218 pronghorn, and 60 of those were resident. So, and 43 were migratory, purely migratory, as in that they migrated every season for which we had data. And 74 of those individuals were considered mixed migratory. So they migrated in some seasons, but not others. And then we evaluated migration for 3 separate seasons. So spring and fall, which are fairly standard, but then pronghorn also have a facultative winter migration when they move, usually in response to like severe winter conditions, in order to find areas that are more conducive or have less snow cover, for example. And so here you can see in this graph, in these maps, each line represents the route of an individual pronghorn during its migration. And you can see almost all of them go right through the wind energy facilities, which is so that we didn't find any evidence that these wind energy facilities were posing a barrier. The animals were still moving through them. But we did find some evidence for impacts on their behavior. So here, this is just predicted speed along each step of an individual's migration during spring and fall. And well, interestingly, they actually move slower closer to the turbines in the fall. We did find evidence that they were moving faster closer to the turbines in the spring, which could have implications for how much energy they have to use while they're migrating. And this is, we found consistent negative effects on spring migration, even if there weren't effects during other seasons. And we think this is likely because these pronghorn are most sensitive during the spring. So they're trying to get to their summer range in order to give birth. And so their body condition is particularly important during this time. So we think they may be more sensitive to disturbance during that spring migration period. We also found that they spent less time in stopovers during the spring, but not during the fall and winter. And this suggests that they spent less time in the stopovers closer to turbines, which suggests they may be less able to take advantage of all of the resources, things like forage that they need in those stopover sites, which could have implications for body condition during the spring migration period. And then interestingly, given how much variation there is among pronghorn individuals, we did find evidence for impacts on their fidelity. But so they had lower fidelity to their migration routes during both spring and fall if their routes were closer to turbines, and they had lower fidelity to their stopover sites in spring when they were closer to turbines. And so this could have implications if they are no longer using specific routes or stopover sites that are close to turbines. Those routes could be lost over time, which could just reduce the resilience of this population. They have fewer options at the population level. And then finally, we did find evidence for impacts on fine scale selection. So these animals were, when they were moving on their migration routes, if they were moving through the wind energy facilities, they were more likely to choose steps that were further away from turbines during spring and winter, which suggests that even though they are moving through these wind energy facilities, they may be detouring around the turbines, trying to avoid them at a small scale. So overall, what does it all mean? I think the fact that the animals were still moving through the wind energy facility suggests that connectivity is maintained, that these areas didn't pose a definite barrier, but that they did make important behavioral adjustments during their migration. They increased their speed closer to turbines. They had reduced fidelity to both routes and stopovers during some seasons. So they could be losing specific migration routes over time. And they exhibited that small scale behavioral avoidance near the turbines. So that could represent some indirect habitat loss where they're not using the areas right around turbines during migration. So all of these represent important behavioral adjustments, but they don't give us direct evidence of fitness consequences. So from this study, we only had location data. We don't know if the fact that these animals are speeding up or spending less time in their stopovers, if that had any consequences for their survival or reproduction, I think, which would be important next steps. But they all represent important impacts on these individuals and so they suggest that these wind energy facilities represent just another form of disturbance that, in addition to the roads and oil and gas development, fences, and so that at some point, we're going to reach a critical threshold of all of this disturbance that would have fitness consequences to these animals. For that, I'd just like to thank all the people who helped fund this research and all of our collaborators. And yeah, thanks for tuning in today.
All right, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you again to all of our 3 presenters today. So we're going to move into the Q&A session for the last 8 or 9 minutes. And as I mentioned before, go ahead and type your questions into the chat and I will relay them to the participants. But I guess Caroline, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera, that would be great. But I guess as people take a minute to think about their questions, maybe I'll pose a couple if that's all right. I guess, Carolina, you were talking a lot about sort of the special semi-arid climate of the Caatinga region and how that's some of the complications that poses for the cat conservation there. Can you kind of, with that in like context, talk a little bit about sort of jaguar and puma conservation in other wetter parts of Brazil, and maybe sort of like is there any talk about conservation efforts, like maybe like reintroduction of big cats in the Caatinga region?
Okay, so Brazil is huge. So we have rainforest, we have the semi-arid condition, and of course, depends on the region. We have different strategies to jaguar and puma conservation. And for example, in Pantanal, we have ecotourism, but it's different in Caatinga because we have a low density population of jaguars and pumas. So it's not easy to see an individual. So tourism is not so good in Caatinga, but in Pantanal, they are doing this effort and it's really great. They have a project in there that includes ecotourism and the conservation of jaguars, for example. And concerning the introduction of jaguars and pumas in Caatinga, the idea is really plausible, but is a little bit complex because it involves environmental, social, and logistical factors. So I think the one thing to mention here is the location of water source, because we're talking about semi-arid condition. And the mother jaguars and pumas teach their cubs the skills to find those waters reservoir. So introducing a captive bred individual to the Caatinga is challenging because it lacks this essential knowledge that potentially limits the ability to find key resources and survive in the biome. So it's different of other biomes in Brazil, like the Amazonia and rainforest, because Caatinga has this specifically challenge of lack of or water scarcity. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you definitely do. That was great. Thank you so much. And I guess to you, Megan, so I know that you're talking about sort of the seasonal differences you noted in speed of migration. Did the previous studies that looked at pronghorn more like habitat choices and wind energy, did they see like a similar seasonal pattern to any sort of like habitat selection, or is that, yeah, I guess I was curious like if there's a real annual changes.
Impacts, yeah, that's a good question. No, not in quite the same way. Not so like we saw very strong impacts during the spring and not so much during the other seasons. And I think previous studies on pronghorn found some impacts during summer and winter, both seasons, but then those were more defined by there's just a lot of individual variation, and they were all there's just a lot of variation among so some individuals seem to be impacted and some didn't seem to care.
Great, thanks. It looks like here's a question for Gonçalo in the chat, who I hope is still with us, even though this video just went blank. So you mentioned you do not use telemetry currently in Portugal to study the wolves. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? You kind of touched on it in your presentation.
Yes, it's not a question that we don't use telemetry in Portugal. It's on the process of environmental impact assessment in the Portuguese guidelines. the government stated that we shouldn't use telemetry as the main source of information because of mostly two things. One, it's because of the time needed for catching wolves, and to have data in due time for the process to occur. And if you have a lot of projects ongoing at the same time, small wind farms with 10 or 20 wind turbines, and every project had to catch wolves, we probably had to catch all the wolves in Portugal to have data. So they say we should rely on indirect approach, scat surveys, and camera trapping. And the other thing is because we have 300 or so animals, it has some liability of catching wolves. It might not go well, and some might be injured or die or something like that. So that's the main thing about using telemetry for environmental impact assessment. But we had used some projects that have other telemetry projects occurring in the surroundings. They can use that data in conjunction with scat surveys and camera trapping to increase the amount of data.
Great, thank you so much. And maybe with the last couple minutes, a question in the chat, wondering if there's anyone could speak to kind of if solar facilities and how the impact those might have on terrestrial mammals compared to wind energy, which I know that you all maybe specialize in, but if anyone wants to speak to that.
I can jump in, I guess.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I'll jump in, I guess. I would think, so I have not studied that personally, but I would expect it to have similar, at least from like migratory ungulate perspective. I mean, you're still going to have road infrastructure as well as the associated habitat loss with the solar farms, if you're talking about it at industrial scale. So I'd expect similar impacts, at least on migratory ungulates. But
Okay, I agree with Megan. In Caatinga, I have not been studying the solar impact, solar energy, but I think the impacts are similar. Caatinga is really vulnerable to climate change. So I think when we install solar panels, the removal of vegetation is really, really big. So we have here habitat loss, and also we have in Caatinga the process of desertification. So semi-arid region becomes an arid region. So this is really important, really, really bad for wildlife and people living in Caatinga. So I think this is the main impact of solar installation.
For the wolves, and at least in Portugal, we have not already a lot of data on that because the solar boom is happening now, and monitoring programs are still starting regarding solar panels. But I think for the wolves, the main thing is about connectivity, because wind farms are not closed. So they don't pose a barrier for wolves to move around. Solar facilities, depending on the fences that they will put around it, may or not impose some kind of barrier. But if it's a very normal fence, just to surround the area, wolves will enter and not get out of it, and they are very adaptable for that. So that won't be the major thing about it. It's always about some human disturbance more on the area than other kind of impacts.
Great, and I'm just looking at the clock. I want to be cognizant of people's time because we're at the top of the hour. But if maybe the speakers feel comfortable and you want to post your email in the chat, and anyone who has further questions, that's okay if they reach out to you directly. But thank you again, the three of you, for a great presentation, and thank you for everyone for coming to this WREN webinar. As Haley mentioned in the chat, this recording will be posted on Tethys, promptly. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.